How does a band survive the death of its founder, decades of addiction, bitter internal wars, and the loss of the drummer who held everything together and still refused to stop? The Rolling Stones have faced more endings than most bands ever get the chance to survive. Brian Jones was gone before they reached the 1970s. Keith Richards came dangerously close to destroying himself. Mick Jagger and Richards spent years barely able to tolerate each other. And when Charlie Watts died, many assumed the final chapter had finally arrived. Yet somehow, Mick Jagger kept moving forward. So, what has allowed him to hold the Rolling Stones together through more than 6 decades of chaos? And if none of those things could end the band, what possibly can? For over 6 decades, Mick Jagger has lived under constant scrutiny. Every action scrutinized, every relationship examined, every word in interviews searched for deeper significance. Yet, despite a lifetime in the public eye, a curious gap has always remained between the image of Mick Jagger and the man behind it. He perfected the balance, offering glimpses without ever fully letting anyone in. That's what makes his recent admissions so striking. When pieced together, they reveal a far more layered figure than the rock legend people thought they knew. To truly understand Jagger, you can't begin with the fame, the concerts, or even the music. You have to start with Keith Richards. Their bond shaped nearly everything. It gave rise to the Rolling Stones, inspired some of rock's most enduring songs, and at times brought both men to the edge of collapse. They first crossed paths as children, then reconnected years later on a train platform in Dartford in 1961. Richards spotted Jagger carrying rare American rhythm and blues records music nearly impossible to find in England at the time. That shared passion altered the course of their lives. Soon, they were making music, living together, writing together, and building something neither could have predicted. But in the beginning, there was no grand plan to conquer popular music. Jagger was still pursuing a very different future. He enrolled at the London School of Economics, while Richards attended art school, and music existed alongside lives that had not yet been completely abandoned for it. The idea that either man would still be performing beside the other more than 60 years later would have seemed almost absurd. What drew them forward was less a carefully designed career than an obsession with a sound. London was developing a small but increasingly energetic rhythm and blues scene, populated by young musicians searching for records by the American artists they admired. Jagger and Richards became part of that world, eventually connecting with guitarist Brian Jones, whose ambitions would prove crucial to the creation of the group. The early Rolling Stones were not yet built around Mick Jagger and Keith Richards as songwriters. Their identity came largely from American blues and rhythm and blues. Chuck Berry, Muddy Waters, Jimmy Reed, Bo Diddley, and other Black American musicians provided a musical vocabulary that these young British players studied with extraordinary intensity. For Jagger, that meant learning more than melodies. As the band's singer, he had to find a way to inhabit music created thousands of miles from the suburban England in which he had grown up, without simply disappearing inside imitation. His voice, movements, and stage presence gradually became part of that answer, and that transformation happened quickly. By 1963, the Rolling Stones were developing a following through their performances at London's Crawdaddy Club. The crowds grew, and so did the sense that something unusual was happening. Their appeal wasn't based on polish. Compared with the cleaner image surrounding much of British pop, the Stones could appear rough, provocative, and unpredictable. Then Andrew Loog Oldham entered the picture. Oldham was remarkably young himself when he began managing the group, but he understood something the musicians had not yet fully grasped. Their rough edges could become an advantage. Instead of trying to make the Rolling Stones resemble the Beatles, he helped cultivate the idea that they could occupy the opposite territory more dangerous, more rebellious, and deliberately less respectable. But image alone wasn't enough. The Stones' early recordings still depended heavily on other people's songs. Their first British single, released in 1963, was a version of Chuck Berry's Come On. Their next major single, I Wanna Be Your Man, came from John Lennon and Paul McCartney. For a band hoping to become more than an exciting rhythm and blues act, that dependence presented a problem. Lennon and McCartney had already demonstrated the enormous advantage of a group capable of producing its own material. Oldham recognized that the Stones needed something similar, and he believed Jagger and Richards could provide it. Neither man initially possessed the identity that later generations would associate with the Jagger-Richards songwriting partnership. They had to learn how to write together. Richards later told a famous story in which Oldham effectively shut the pair away with guitars and demanded that they produce a song before emerging. Jagger has remembered the circumstances differently, suggesting the tale became more literal in the retelling than it had been in reality. Whatever the precise details, the underlying pressure was real. Oldham pushed them toward composition. At first, the results did not necessarily sound like the Rolling Stones people would later recognize. One of their earliest important compositions was As Tears Go By, a delicate ballad far removed from the hard rhythm and blues with which the band was becoming associated. Rather than initially using it as a Stones showcase, Oldham gave the song to the teenage Marianne Faithfull, whose 1964 recording became a hit. That success demonstrated something important. Jagger and Richards could write material that existed independently of the band's performances. They weren't simply learning how to reproduce the music they loved anymore. They were beginning to understand how songs themselves were constructed. The partnership then accelerated. In early 1965, The Last Time became the first Jagger-Richards composition released as a Rolling Stones A-side in Britain. It reached #1 there. Later that same year came I Can't Get No Satisfaction, and the scale of everything changed. Within only a few years of that accidental reunion in Dartford, two young men who had originally bonded as obsessive listeners had become one of popular music's most commercially powerful songwriting teams. But their partnership was never based on the two men being identical. That may have been precisely why it worked. Richards increasingly developed the guitar language at the center of the Stones' sound, the riffs, tunings, and rhythmic instincts that would become unmistakable. Jagger brought melody, lyrics, vocal character, and an instinct for how a song could communicate beyond the musicians playing it. Their contributions could overlap, and over the decades both men have sometimes remembered the origins of individual songs differently, but the tension between their approaches became part of the machinery. They could challenge each other because they did not see everything the same way. And as the Rolling Stones became bigger, that difference stopped being merely creative. Success introduced money, management, ego, responsibility, and pressure on a scale neither man had experienced before. The friendship that had begun with records and rehearsals was gradually transformed into something much harder to define. Part friendship, part creative partnership, part business alliance, and eventually part struggle over what the Rolling Stones themselves were supposed to be. That distinction would matter enormously, because as the band entered the 1970s, Keith Richards moved deeper into a lifestyle that increasingly threatened his freedom, his health, and at times, his ability to function. Jagger moved in almost the opposite direction. The more unstable the world around the Rolling Stones became, the more he appeared to understand the value of remaining functional inside it. The two boys who had once been united almost entirely by music were beginning to assume very different roles. And for Mick Jagger, keeping Keith Richards close would eventually mean learning how to live beside chaos without allowing that chaos to consume him too. But beneath the myth of the Glamour twins lay a much more difficult reality. In recent years, Jagger has spoken more candidly about how draining and complex his relationship with Richards has been, not just due to creative clashes, but because Richards spent much of the 1970s battling severe addiction. Jagger has described the strain of working alongside someone consumed by substance abuse, while also bearing the weight of keeping one of the world's biggest bands running. What makes his reflections especially revealing is what he admits he never understood. Despite decades side by side, they rarely discussed what Richards was truly feeling during those dark years. Consider that two men linked professionally and personally for over 60 years, yet separated by an emotional barrier. That fact alone speaks volumes about who Jagger really is. Attentive, composed, engaged, but always holding part of himself back, shielded from view. That distance never fully closed. Over time, another tension emerged. Richards increasingly saw himself as the keeper of the Rolling Stones' soul, guarding the band against commercialism. Jagger, meanwhile, became the strategist, the one managing tours, contracts, branding, and the mechanics of sustaining a global enterprise. Richards criticized him openly, sometimes harshly. There were moments when fans feared the band might not survive. But Jagger eventually acknowledged something significant. He stopped expecting the conflict to end. He accepted that he and Richards simply see the Rolling Stones in different ways, and they likely always will. But the story takes a darker turn with one event that left a lasting mark on Jagger, whether he chooses to discuss it or not. Altamont. The free Rolling Stones concert at Altamont Speedway in December 1969 became one of rock's most notorious moments. Poor planning, minimal security, Hell's Angels hired as crowd control, violence erupting early, and by night's end, 4 people were dead, including 18-year-old Meredith Hunter, whose killing was filmed during the performance. For years, Altamont was framed as the symbolic end of the 1960s, the moment peace and idealism gave way to chaos and violence. Jagger has consistently challenged that narrative, not because he denies the tragedy, but because turning it into a cultural metaphor risks erasing its human cost. For him, it wasn't about the fall of an era. It was about the fact that someone died at an event his band organized. That truth stayed with him. Then, decades later, he learned something even more unsettling. According to declassified FBI reports, Hell's Angels members were reportedly enraged by Jagger's public criticism after Altamont. So angry, in fact, that they allegedly plotted to attack him at his home in the Hamptons, planning to arrive by boat to bypass security. Bad weather supposedly forced them to turn back. The most jarring part? Jagger says he had no idea any of this happened at the time. Imagine finding out years later that there may have been a plan to harm you, and no one ever told you. No security, no authorities, nobody. Jagger admitted that learning about the alleged plot reshaped his view of fame, visibility, and the unseen risks of speaking out. It made him realize danger could be present without his awareness. And perhaps that realization helps explain the emotional reserve he's always maintained. But long before the spotlight and turmoil, there was a different Mick Jagger growing up in wartime England. Born in Dartford, Kent, in 1943, his father was a physical education teacher, his mother, a hairdresser. By his own account, theirs was an ordinary household. No wealth, no connections, just a modest home where entertainment came from within. It was there, he says, that his urge to perform first took root, making people laugh, commanding attention, shaping the mood of a room. Then came American rhythm and blues. As a teenager, Jagger became captivated by its raw energy and freedom. To him, it represented something missing from post-war British life, something rebellious and vital. When he and Keith Richards bonded over those records, they weren't just sharing a taste in music. They were reaching for a different world. But when the Rolling Stones arrived in America in 1964, the reality shocked him. Jagger has openly described parts of the U.S. at the time as deeply oppressive. Segregation was widespread, racism overt. The contradiction troubled him deeply. The music he loved came from Black American artists who were often mistreated in their own country. That awareness stayed with him. He later said it changed how he viewed the connection between art and the conditions that produced it. The romantic idea of American freedom, drawn from the music, collided with a far harsher truth. Rather than resolve the contradiction, Jagger carried both realities at once, a trait that would define him. He saw complexity clearly, without pretending it could be neatly untangled. Nowhere is this clearer than in the music. People like to believe legendary songs emerge from sudden inspiration, but Jagger has always been unusually direct about songwriting. He says most of it came from relentless work, not flashes of genius. Satisfaction, the song that catapulted the Stones to global fame, reportedly came together during an unremarkable moment beside a pool in Florida on tour. No divine spark, no dramatic breakthrough, just years of constant writing and performing finally yielding something unforgettable. That honesty makes his reflections on other songs all the more compelling. Take Brown Sugar, one of the band's most debated tracks. Jagger has admitted he now feels uneasy about it. Even he can't fully explain where some of its darker lyrics originated. In recent years, the band has quietly stopped playing it live. That willingness to reevaluate his own work matters. He doesn't deny the complexity it's there, and he acknowledges it. Then there's Exile on Main Street. Of all the Rolling Stones albums, Jagger has increasingly pointed to that chaotic early 70s period as the band's creative peak. Recorded mostly at Keith Richards' villa in southern France amid legal issues, financial strain, addiction, and disorder, the album somehow became a masterpiece. But the mythology surrounding Exile can make the reality sound almost too romantic. The Rolling Stones had not gone to France simply because the Mediterranean seemed like an inspiring place to make a record. By 1971, their financial affairs had become a serious problem. Facing a massive British tax burden and attempting to untangle years of complicated business arrangements, The members left Britain and became tax exiles. Keith Richards rented Villa Nelcote, a sprawling Belle Epoque mansion overlooking the Mediterranean at Villefranche-sur-Mer. It looked like the kind of place where wealthy people disappeared for a summer. Instead, parts of it became an improvised recording studio. There was no conventional studio waiting downstairs. The Rolling Stones brought in their mobile recording unit, parked it outside, and ran cables into the villa. Musicians and instruments were scattered through basement rooms where the heat, humidity, poor acoustics, and technical limitations made recording difficult. Sessions took place at irregular hours, often depending on who happened to be available and capable of playing. Some nights produced little. On others, the musicians suddenly locked together and played for hours. People drifted through Nelcote, and the boundary between the recording sessions and the chaotic life surrounding them became increasingly difficult to separate. Keith was at the center of that world. Because it was his house, the sessions naturally revolved around him. But Richards was also descending further into heroin addiction. The same musician capable of finding a guitar phrase that could organize an entire song could also become unreliable enough to make the process painfully slow. Jagger responded differently. He did not immerse himself in life at Nelcote to the same degree, and when the recordings moved beyond France, he became heavily involved in transforming the accumulated material into a finished album. Additional vocals, overdubs, and mixing work took place in Los Angeles. That distinction matters. The legend of exile is often presented as chaos, somehow producing greatness, but chaos alone did not make exile on Main Street. Someone still had to organize what had been captured, decide what mattered, add what was missing, and turn months of fragmented sessions into an album that could actually be released. In that sense, Exile offers an unusually clear picture of a dynamic that would follow Jagger and Richards for decades. Richards could flourish inside disorder. Jagger was often the man who eventually had to give that disorder a shape. And yet neither man has ever reduced Exile to a repeatable formula. Perhaps that is why the record remains so difficult to imitate. Its character came partly from circumstances the Stones themselves could barely control. They survived Nelcote, but they had already learned that not everyone around them would survive the world the Rolling Stones had created. Because before Keith Richards became the most famous example of a Rolling Stone living dangerously close to the edge, there was Brian Jones. And Brian's story ended very differently. Before Mick Jagger became the unquestioned visual center of the Rolling Stones, Jones had been one of the band's defining figures. He was instrumental in assembling the group, gave it its name, and in the earliest period occupied a position of extraordinary importance. Brian had immersed himself in blues with an intensity that impressed the musicians around him, but his importance soon extended far beyond blues guitar. He could move between instruments with remarkable ease, and as the Stones developed, his musical curiosity became one of their greatest advantages. When a song needed a different texture, Brian often found it. Across the Stones' 1960s recordings, he contributed slide guitar, harmonica, sitar, marimba, dulcimer, recorder, keyboards, and other instruments. The sitar on Paint It, Black, the marimba on Under My Thumb, and the dulcimer on Lady Jane demonstrated how far his role had expanded beyond simply standing beside Keith Richards with another guitar. For a time, Jones was one of the people pushing the Rolling Stones beyond the blues and rhythm and blues vocabulary from which they had emerged. But the internal structure of the band was changing around him. Andrew Loog Oldham's decision to push Jagger and Richards toward writing their own songs created more than a string of hits. It gradually shifted the center of power inside the Rolling Stones. Brian had helped create the band, but Mick and Keith increasingly created the songs, and that was a different kind of influence. Every successful Jagger-Richards composition strengthened a partnership from which Jones was largely excluded. As their songwriting became central to the Stones' identity, Brian's original leadership became less important. The change happened while fame was transforming all of them. By the second half of the 1960s, Jones was increasingly struggling with drugs, legal problems, turbulent relationships, and deteriorating reliability. His ability to participate consistently became uncertain. The tragedy is that his decline was not a simple story of talent disappearing. The talent was still visible, but increasingly it appeared in flashes. One of those flashes came during No Expectations, recorded during the Beggars Banquet sessions in 1968. Brian played slide guitar while the musicians gathered closely around open microphones. What stayed with Jagger years later was not simply the quality of the performance, but the sense that Brian was present again, engaged, useful, part of the band. Jagger would later remember it as the last occasion on which he felt Brian was completely involved in something musically worthwhile. That memory becomes considerably more painful when placed beside what followed. By 1969, the Rolling Stones were preparing to return to touring in America. Brian's condition had become more than an emotional problem within the group. It was now a practical obstacle. His drug convictions complicated his ability to travel to the United States, while his declining reliability made the prospect of a major tour increasingly difficult. In June, Jagger, Richards, and Charlie Watts went to see him. The result was Brian's departure from the Rolling Stones. The band he had helped create was going to continue without him. Less than a month later, on the 3rd of July 1969, Brian Jones was found dead in the swimming pool at Cochford Farm, his home in Sussex. He was 27. The official inquest returned a verdict of death by misadventure, with drowning and the effects of drugs and alcohol central to the finding. Later allegations and theories about the circumstances of his death have persisted for decades, but they have never produced a universally accepted replacement for the official conclusion. For the Rolling Stones, there was almost no time in which grief could exist separately from the machinery of the band. 2 days after Brian died, the Stones were scheduled to appear at a massive free concert in Hyde Park. They went ahead with it. Jagger walked onto the stage dressed in white, and read lines from Percy Bysshe Shelley's Adonais, the elegy written after the death of John Keats. Butterflies were released in Brian's memory, yet the concert was simultaneously a memorial and a beginning, because standing with the Rolling Stones that day was Mick Taylor, the guitarist brought in to replace Jones. Few moments better capture the strange brutality of life inside a famous band. They were publicly mourning the man who had helped create the Rolling Stones while demonstrating at the same time that the Rolling Stones could survive him. And survive they did. That fact makes Jagger's later reflections on Brian especially uncomfortable. When discussing Jones decades later, Jagger did not claim responsibility for his death, but neither did he pretend the band's behavior toward him had always been admirable. He acknowledged that they had behaved childishly and had picked on Brian. At the same time, he remembered Jones as jealous, difficult, and capable of provoking hostility in the people around him. Those realities do not cancel each other out. Brian could be extraordinarily talented and extremely difficult. He could hurt the people around him and still be vulnerable himself. His bandmates could have legitimate reasons for being exhausted by his behavior and still regret how they responded to someone who was deteriorating in front of them. That complexity is more revealing than turning Brian into either a saint or a villain. And for Jagger, there was a lesson buried inside it that would repeat itself with Keith Richards. You could care about someone, depend upon his talent, become furious with him, watch him damage himself, and still be unable to save him. With Brian, the story ended in a swimming pool. With Keith, somehow, it didn't. Richards survived the heroin years. He survived arrests, addiction, and decades of mythology built around the possibility that one day his body simply would not take any more. And the Rolling Stones survived with him. That changed the nature of Jagger's role. As the decades accumulated, being the frontman was no longer enough. Keeping a band of this size alive required decisions about tours, recordings, schedules, contracts, and the enormous business infrastructure surrounding an international operation. This is where the public image of Jagger becomes misleading. On stage, he appears almost entirely instinctive. Everything moves. He runs, dances, gestures, improvises, and seems to exist completely in the immediate moment. But the survival of the Rolling Stones depended on almost the opposite qualities: planning, discipline, preparation, repetition, and the willingness to treat something born from youthful rebellion as an institution that had to be maintained. That may be one of the great paradoxes of Mick Jagger. The man who came to symbolize abandon became essential to preserving the structure that allowed that abandon to exist. And year after year, the list of events the Rolling Stones had survived became increasingly extraordinary. Brian Jones was gone. Keith's addiction did not destroy them. The catastrophe of Altamont did not destroy them. Mick Taylor left in 1974. The relationship between Jagger and Richards deteriorated so badly during the 1980s that the future of the group appeared genuinely uncertain. Bill Wyman eventually left. Jagger and Richards fought, reconciled, insulted each other, and worked together again. The band kept recording and touring. Eventually, survival itself became part of the Rolling Stones mythology. Then came a loss that seemed different from all the others: Charlie Watts. For almost 6 decades, Watts occupied a unique position inside the group. He was neither Jagger nor Richards, and that was precisely the point. While those two personalities could collide, Charlie often seemed to exist outside their competition. His restraint was fundamental to the Stones' sound. Keith's guitar could push and pull against the beat. Mick could move across it. But Charlie gave the music its center. More importantly, he gave the people around him one too. For years, the possibility of a Rolling Stones without Charlie Watts seemed almost impossible to imagine. Then, in August 2021, Watts died at the age of 80. This time, the Stones could not simply wait for a member to recover. There would be no return. They had already arranged for drummer Steve Jordan to substitute for Watts on their upcoming American dates while Charlie recovered from a medical procedure. Jordan was not a random replacement. He had worked extensively with Keith Richards, and Watts had approved the arrangement. After Charlie died, however, the question became unavoidable. Should the Rolling Stones continue? They did. When the tour resumed in St. Louis in September 2021, the opening moments of the show belonged to Charlie. Images of him filled the screens before the band began playing, and Jagger spoke about how emotional it was to see them. For the first time, the Rolling Stones were entering a future that Charlie Watts would never share. Jagger did not pretend the adjustment was easy. In later interviews, he continued to speak about Charlie in strikingly ordinary terms, not merely as the drummer of the Rolling Stones, but as the person whose humor, taste, elegance, and company he missed. He described still thinking about what Charlie might have played on a song, or whether he would have liked something they were doing. That is what loss can look like after the mythology disappears. Not always a dramatic revelation. Sometimes it is simply wanting to ask someone a question and remembering that you cannot. But once again, the Rolling Stones converted loss into movement. In 2023, they released Hackney Diamonds, their first studio album of original material since A Bigger Bang in 2005. Charlie was still present on 2 tracks recorded before his death, while Steve Jordan played drums on much of the remaining material. Jagger was not merely participating in the project, he was pushing it toward completion. After years of sessions that had failed to produce a finished Stones album, the band committed to completing one, working closely with producer Andrew Watt, and moving at a pace that surprised even people accustomed to the Stones' long history. Hackney Diamonds was not presented as a farewell. That matters, because farewell has never really suited the Rolling Stones. They have repeatedly reached moments that could have served as endings, only to treat them as transitions instead. Brian's death could have been the ending. It wasn't. Keith's addiction could have been the ending. It wasn't. The Jagger-Richards conflict of the 1980s could have been the ending. It wasn't. Charlie's death could have been the ending. It wasn't. And perhaps that helps explain why Jagger's reflections sound different now. Age has not suddenly transformed him into someone eager to reveal everything. He still controls what he gives away, and he still resists simple psychological explanations for his life. But time changes the meaning of memory. When Jagger looks backward now, many of the people inside those memories are no longer available to argue with him, laugh with him, or offer their own version. Brian has been gone since 1969. Charlie is gone. Friends, collaborators, and contemporaries have disappeared. Jagger himself has spoken about the unavoidable experience of losing more people as one grows older. Mortality is no longer an abstraction surrounding the Rolling Stones. It has become part of their history. Perhaps that is why the older Jagger can look back at Brian Jones and acknowledge that they sometimes treated him badly without turning the admission into a dramatic confession. Perhaps that is why he can talk about Charlie not simply as a legendary drummer, but as a friend whose judgment and humor he still misses. The distance between Mick Jagger the performer and Mick Jagger the private man has not disappeared. There are simply fewer reasons to pretend that 6 decades of survival came without a cost, and that changes the final question. For most of their career, people asked when the Rolling Stones would break up. They assumed ego would do it, or drugs, or money. or Mick and Keith finally becoming unable to tolerate each other. None of those predictions worked. Today, the question is much simpler. How long can their bodies keep doing what their wills have repeatedly refused to stop doing? Because, after everything the Rolling Stones have survived, the greatest threat left is not scandal. It is not addiction. It is not another argument between Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. It is time, and time is the one opponent even the Rolling Stones have never defeated. They have only kept it waiting.